Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Tonight we present the second part of Raghuram Rajan's only exit interview. Part one was last night when the governor spoke about his failed negotiations with the government to stay on, why he had spoken out about tolerance, and at the times he's spoken also about the relationship between the RBI and the Finance Ministry. Tonight in part two, he speaks about the economy, why mini bank reforms are better than big bang ones, why India needs some form of a planning commission. He speaks about economic growth and the impact of beef bans and nationalism controversies on the economy. Here's the interview. We present tonight the second part of Raghuram Rajan's exit interview, and in fact it's the only exit interview he's given as he steps down from the governorship of the Reserve Bank of India. Yesterday I spoke to him about how he views the job he's held for the last 3 years, the issues he's had to face, the criticisms he's had to contend with, his successes and failures. Tonight, in the second part of this exclusive interview, we shall talk to Dr. Rajan about the challenges facing the Indian economy, the state in which he leaves it, and how he believes India should respond to these challenges. Dr. Rajan, let's come to the state of the economy as you step down as governor of the RBI. As you said in your annual report released on Monday, although the economy is growing at 7.6% this year, it's still below the levels the country is capable of. If a layman were to ask you what's holding the economy back, what would your answer be?
I'd say private investment. In other words, corporations aren't building new factories, they aren't putting in new machines, they aren't increasing jobs at the rate one would wish them to. And why aren't they doing it? Well, partly because the level of capacity utilization, how much capacity they're able to sell, is still relatively low. My hope is that with a good monsoon, you're seeing some sectors, demand is picking up very strongly. For example, automobiles, cement is also starting to pick up. So once we have a good monsoon, a feel-good factor prevails in the economy, people start buying more, and then there's a virtuous circle that demand energizes private investment, and that builds on what public investment is already doing.
Now, the economic statistics that were released on Wednesday actually have created a sort of piquant situation, because it looks prima facie as if you have a situation where you have decelerating growth alongside accelerating inflation. If this was your responsibility after Sunday, and I know it won't be, but if it were, how would you handle it?
Well, I don't want to talk about what monetary policy should be going forward. I'll comment on the numbers, GDP numbers. Remember, the last quarter was 7.9%, and this quarter is much lower. And it may well be that certain numbers, because it was the end of the year, the last quarter, some numbers have spilled over, for example, on subsidies and taxes. So as a result, an appropriate way to view the growth of the economy may be more an average of the two. We are chugging along at about 7.5% at this point.
But are you worried by the fact that growth seems to have fallen markedly from 7.9 to 7.1? And although I know you said yesterday that inflation would not be at 6.1 or 6.07 when the August figures come out, it will be lower. But nonetheless, at the moment, it looks as if growth is slightly falling while inflation is rising.
Well, as I said again, the inflation numbers probably reflect some seasonality and should adjust going forward. But also, I think better to look at not look at quarter by quarter growth numbers, but look at an average, and we seem to be doing reasonably. Of course, is 7.5 something we should be satisfied with? Probably not.
Can I ask you at this point about, in fact, India's GDP calculation? I know you've been asked this question before and you feel that, in fact, the press misrepresented you, and perhaps you could clarify your thinking. But not just economists, not just newspapers, but recently even the US State Department has expressed a certain measure of concern, in particular about the January-March 7.9 figure. And that's largely because it was believed that under it lies something like 143,000 crore of discrepancies. And analysts have pointed out that last year, during the same period, discrepancies were just 30,000 crore, and this suggests to them that pretty close to 50% of the GDP growth for that particular quarter was as a result of discrepancies, and if you remove them, the growth would come down to 4%. Do you share that concern?
No,
or are you much more sanguine and happy?
Right. I think better statisticians than I have pointed out that one shouldn't worry too much about the discrepancy. I think the What is important is that we have some difficulties with the deflator measure, and that is creating some uncertainty about what true growth is. Now, that said, how much is that uncertainty? What could the range of true growth be? I would say it's probably within the range of 1% around where we are. So whether it's 6.5 or 8.5, I mean, those are pretty good numbers regardless of which one you pick.
But the range could be as much as 6.5 to 8.5. It's a
No,
2% range.
That's my layman's view of putting it, that it's hard for me to believe it's so much outside that range.
Now, in a speech you made last week, you said India needs more of a series of mini bang rather than big bang reforms. What in your mind is the difference between mini bang and big bang, and why does India need the former and not the latter?
So we are an economy which is liberalizing, and I think what serves us well is to liberalize, see the consequences of that liberalization, liberalize more.
So step by step and steadily.
Step by step and steadily. I think if we want to get from point A to point B, the way we have really managed to do it without upsetting too many people, upsetting too many sort of constraints in the economy, is to do it in a measured way. I think that's what I meant when I talked about market reforms. We brought in a bunch of market reforms last week, and my sense is this is just the first step. But as we see these play out, see how they work, we can think of a new set which build on these.
In other words, you're saying, given the nature of the country we are, steady, continual mini bang reforms are easier for the country to accept and take. You don't provoke vested interest. Big bang reforms run the risk of a big reaction.
Well, it's not just interest, it's also that you may not have the systems to cope with a large change. And it's better to build up these systems as you go. Now, there are occasions when you have to say, okay, it can't be incremental at this point, I have to move from A to B. You can't be half pregnant. You have to move from one place to another place. To my mind, at least on the market reforms, that's not the place we are. We can do it with a bunch of incremental reforms.
Now, industrialists and economists often, if not often, maybe even frequently talk about two reforms in particular: labor reforms and land reforms. And I know that a handful of states, 3 or 4, are prepared to bite the bullet, but the truth is that the centre itself lacks enthusiasm as far as these two reforms are concerned. But just last week, Time magazine said that these two are crucial reforms. Do you agree with Time magazine, or do you think the emphasis that's put by economists and industrialists on labor and land reforms is somewhat exaggerated?
Well, first, I think this has been said for a long time. So Time magazine is the latest comer, but a lot of Indian economists have been talking about labor and land reform. And I think that, yes, they are important, they have to be done, but again, we need systems. For example, when you take labor reform, do we move immediately to a system where there is no security of employment? Don't you need some sort of redress mechanism, in fact, if in fact somebody is fired for cause? What is the appeal process? Does that happen in finite time? That's an example of the kind of system we need to have. We need to have a social security system to support the worker who is laid off because of economic difficulty. So as we proceed, we need to make sure that the entire system is built out. And that means a process of incrementalism.
In other words, before you rush to implement labor reforms, particularly reforms that include some form of hire and fire, set in place the system, set in place the security net, so that you are adequately prepared for the reform you have in mind.
I think that is what most sensible economists would say. Again, it's the point about if you move too fast on one dimension, you outrun other dimensions which are also needed at the same time.
Now, over the last 2 years, India has been periodically shaken by Ghar Vapsi and Love Jihad campaigns, by beef bans, by quarrels about nationalism or Bharat Mata Ki Jai. And there's no doubt that this has divided the political world and the media world. But the critical question is, has it had an impact on investor sentiment and the performance of the economy? No one's absolutely sure what the answer to that is. I'm asking you.
I think we are a very noisy economy, a noisy polity. So there's always a debate about something or the other reflected in noisy television programs. But if you look at the sensex, it's doing very well. If you look at bond yields, they're very low. So I think the takeaway has to be that at least the markets seem to be ignoring noise.
And looking forward, last year, for instance, we had the best year of FDI. I believe record levels exceeding 50 billion came in, more than in any year previously. But at the moment, when you look at the picture of India, there's division and discord in our politics. There's a growing problem in Kashmir that's unresolved. And then you have deteriorating relations between India and Pakistan. And do you worry that this could collectively cause concern in the minds of foreign investors, perhaps even put them off?
Well, look, I think that political difficulties have happened throughout India's history. There's always some issues being discussed. I think investors tend to see through this.
Foreign as well?
Foreign also. Of course, I'm not saying nothing would perturb them, but my sense is that they have come to accept that emerging markets, including India, will have noisy politics. Now, what is interesting is the industrial countries themselves have very noisy politics at this point. And so it seems to me we are in a state of the world where, in fact, that will be true.
Now, last week again, Goldman Sachs, one of the most reputed investment banks in the world, said that there were 3 international factors that ought to be causes of concern. In fact, they used the word worry for India. The first they identified as concerns to do with the Chinese economy. The second was the uncertainty to do with the way Brexit was likely to play out. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the fact that it now looks almost certain that the US Fed, sometime in the next few weeks or months, will not only raise interest rates, but perhaps raise them more sharply than was expected, and that in turn will have an adverse impact on capital flows. Would you accept that these are 3 factors that people in India should keep a close eye on, that they are causes of concern?
I think, these are some of the factors which we should keep in mind. There's of course China and what is happening in the Chinese economy and whether they are able to soften the landing. But again, I would say that pick any point in recent history, and there are always a whole bunch of concerns. The Chinese soft landing has been talked about since 2001. Will China have a soft landing or not?
And we still don't know.
And we still don't know. Well, it has had many landings since, and thus far, fortunately, they've been soft. But the point really is that from our perspective as an economy, what should we do? And I've said repeatedly, if we focus on macro stability through good policies, adequate buffers, and ensuring that we don't borrow short-term in substantial measure, we should be relatively prepared, well prepared for any global turmoil.
3 quick questions about specific issues. GST, no doubt, is a significant achievement, but the key concern now seems to be about what should the standard rate be. The chief economic advisor has suggested a rate somewhere between 16.9 and 18.9, but you know, as I do, that several state governments want a rate in excess of 20.
I'll stop you there. I can't answer the question, what should the rate be? That's a fiscal question, monetary policy, no view.
Okay. A second quick issue. There's a lot of concern about job creation in India. India needs to create between 10,000 and 12 million, jobs a year. But a recent survey done by the Labour Bureau suggests that 8 of the top labour-intensive sectors in India last year only created 1.35 lakh jobs, which is barely 1% of what we need. Are we dramatically failing to create the jobs we need, or are we overlooking the fact that SMEs are doing it, but they don't get reflected in surveys like this?
Well, so you point to two answers. One is we need to count the jobs we create better. And we may indeed be creating jobs, probably not as much in the formal sector as we would like to, but many jobs in the informal and the small sector which we're not counting as well as we should.
We just don't know about them.
We don't count them properly. But that is not to take away from the fact that we do need to create many more jobs. And to my mind, the way to create those jobs is exactly what we're trying to do. Build out infrastructure, make doing business easier, improve the quality of finance, and increase the quality of human capital. If we do all these, jobs will come.
So the sort of concerns that are expressed by people like Professor Rajiv Kumar, who's a former Secretary General of FICCI, that India is doing nowhere near enough to create jobs, you think that's a somewhat exaggerated concern at the moment?
I wouldn't say that. I would say that we do need to create jobs. This is the issue of the moment for everybody in India. How do we create more jobs? I would say that the number 1 point something lakh that you put out may not reflect the extent of true jobs that are being created, but nevertheless it is obvious we need to create far more and better jobs.
And one final issue, ease of doing business. Now the government is very proud of the fact that India has jumped 12 places in the World Bank scale, but you know and I know that Western and Indian investors are constantly complaining about how difficult it is to do business in India. And in fact, only a couple of days ago, the US Commerce Secretary actually said so publicly. And at Davos, Neeraj Kanwar, the Vice Chairman of Apollo Tyres, said that what takes a couple of weeks in Hungary can take 18 months or more in India. Is ease of business somewhere an area where we haven't put in adequate attention and where we need to do a lot more and think carefully about what we do and how we do it?
Well, yes, we should be aware of where too much time is needed, but there are areas of success. I can file my taxes here in India more easily than I can file it in the United States.
Is that really so?
It is so. I can make payments on the net which I cannot do in the United States.
You mean the facilitation procedures are easier?
The facilitation process, I cannot make an electronic payment on my taxes. I have to send a physical check. Maybe I haven't figured it out in the United States, but here I have figured it out. And I can do it more simply. So at the same time, while saying that we have a long way to go in some areas, there are areas of tremendous success, and what we need to do is replicate that all around.
My final question, and this is one where I ask you to look back not just on your term as governor, but also earlier as chief economic advisor. Given the nature of country we are, given the nature of our economy, was the government wise to scrap the Planning Commission, or do you think India is a country where a certain measure of central planning is still required?
You really want me to say something controversial? Look, I think we need a certain amount of looking ahead, seeing what is needed. Whether it's called the Planning Commission, whether it's called the Niti Aayog, I think what really matters is that it prepares us in terms of policies, in terms of analysis, and that institution, an economic analysis institution which gives some kind of guidance both to the center and the state about what is coming and what we should prepare for, is something that we need.
So in layman's terms, you're saying a certain measure of central planning and an institution that can do it is necessary?
I'm not saying that it needs to be exactly what the Planning Commission was. I think that is what the Niti Aayog is trying to do the analysis that is necessary for us to be able to manage the economy. I think that institution which enables us to do the economic analysis, the evaluation, is absolutely necessary.
If I understand correctly, you're saying the more the Niti Aayog functions like the Planning Commission used to, even though the name has changed, the better.
I didn't say that. I just said there is a need for an organization that helps prepare us for the future, that helps us analyze our programs, that helps us design better programs. That's what the Niti Aayog seems to be doing.
Governor Rajan, thank you very much for this wonderful interview. Now, as you leave this country, and you say you will be coming back, will you be willing, when you come back, to resume something that you didn't, that gave you a lot of kudos? Speak to the Indian people from time to time, share with them your thinking, and then share with them your analysis of where the country is going?
No, I would certainly be very interested in speaking with the young, and I will continue doing that.
So universities in India can continue to hope to see Raghuram Rajan, even though it may not be for a year?
After a period, yes, absolutely.
Governor Rajan, a pleasure speaking to you, and
thank you.
Welcome back. You're watching To The Point. Joining me now to discuss the Raghuram Rajan interview is Senior Fellow of the Observer Research Foundation, Mihir Sharma, and the founder editor of TheWire.in, M.K. Venu. Mihir Sharma, let's start with what the governor revealed about his departure. He's made it fairly clear that he was willing to stay, provided he and the government could come to the right agreement. And the problem, as he put it, was that A, they have different horizons, and B, he himself couldn't stay away from academia for too long, because as he feared, he could end up becoming incompetent as research. Did you get the feeling that Raghuram Rajan might have been willing to serve a one-year extension, but 2 years was 1 year too many?
I think that's definitely what he was trying to convey, that you know, there was a certain limit to how long he could be here. And it is true that he would have had to forego tenure most American universities do not tend to hand out, allow tenured professors to spend that much time away off campus.
And
even Larry Summers.
And for the sake of an Indian audience, tenure in America is for life, and it's a valued thing to have.
And it's a valued thing to have. And so he might have had to forego it, and they make very few exceptions. As I said, Larry Summers, for example, discovered that he was not an exception. There are other people in India who will come up against this problem shortly. Sugata Bose of the Trinamool, for example. It's entirely possible that was one of the considerations. At least that's what he's trying to convey. And
M.K. Venu, given Raghuram Rajan's preeminence and given the enormous assurance he gives both domestic as well as international investors, should the government have agreed to give him a one-year extension, because that way they could retain him rather than apparently insist on 2 years and end up losing him?
Yeah, they could have agreed to give him a one-year extension, because my sense, Karan, is that Raghuram Rajan wanted to finish some of the incomplete projects that he had begun, and one piece which he spoke about in your interview, on which he was directly in touch with the Prime Minister, actually, on financial inclusion. He spoke about the payment bank, but mind you, he was also working very closely with the PM on making the Jan Dhan Yojana work, because a lot of work still needs to be done on Jan Dhan Yojana, with banks having to sort of create a whole infrastructure and send about 100,000 banking correspondents with ATMs, handheld ATMs, to far-flung villages where having a bank branch would be unviable. So I think that piece was also something I believe close to his heart. So while he did manage to put in the payment systems framework, but the overall financial inclusion piece, I think he would have wanted to finish that.
And you're also suggesting, you're also suggesting it would have been in the government's interest to agree to giving him a 1 year and not insisting on a 2-year extension, because he was so closely involved on this financial inclusion project that is so close and dear to the PM's heart. It would have been in the PM and the government's interest to agree to a 1-year extension. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I think it would have been in their interest to do.
Now,
but I have, Karan, I have another.
I'll come back to you in a moment's time. Hold on there. Raghuram Rajan, also Meher Sharma, spoke about the relationship between the Finance Ministry and the RBI. He said, once the Finance Ministry has set the inflation target for the RBI to follow, it should then leave it to the RBI Governor to decide, in his best judgment, how to follow it and how to implement it. In other words, set the task, but give the governor the autonomy to fulfill it the way he wants. Don't keep telling him when to raise and when to lower interest rates. And when he said all of that, did you get the impression that Dr. Rajan was actually indicating this is not what happened in his case?
I think it's not just Dr. Rajan's case, as the biography of, the memoirs of Governor Subbarao made clear, and it was on the headlines. Finance ministers have often been willing to hand over advice to the RBI governor as to what the future direction of monetary policy should be. The one difference, I think, with Dr. Rajan's tenure is that he has helped put into place a system by which there is actually no reason and no way in which the finance minister can credibly tell the next governor about this. Two reasons. The first and most important is that until this March, the RBI was responsible for two things. It was responsible both for maintaining growth and development and for inflation. As of this March, the RBI is now responsible just for inflation.
With an MPC there to support it.
With the official and formal target of 6% in next March. So essentially, when P. Chidambaram or someone would say about Subbarao, if he doesn't care about growth, then that's fine, the government will walk alone. All right, he was basically saying that you're doing half your job and not the other half. No longer can a finance minister tell the RBI governor that.
In other words, whatever the pressure Rajan may have suffered when he was governor because of the ministry leaning on the governor, that won't be the case hereafter, because he's ensured for his successor a system has been put in place that guarantees the autonomy of the RBI in terms of how it implements whatever target the government has set.
hopefully, I mean, and fortunately, the person who helped design the system, Urjit Patel, is in fact the next governor, so he understands exactly what these concerns are.
Now, M.K. Venu, Dr. Rajan had a very forceful defense of his handling of interest rates. He said the credibility of the new inflation regime, as well as the credibility of the bank itself, required that he resist the popular clamor to lower interest rates, and instead he should stand by his own best judgment. Were you convinced by his explanation at that point?
Karan, I have a different take on this. Just bear with me. In fact, I've written about this in the Wire. I think the interest rate controversy, Karan, to some extent was a red herring, because I don't think Finance Minister Jaitley was so unhappy with Mr. Rajan for not having brought down interest rates to the extent that he may have wanted, or the industry may have wanted. In my view, there was a lot of pressure on Rajan, and this was mostly unsaid, from the top industrial houses who have run up some 7.5 lakh crore of debt, not paid their debts have been in the past been restructured, but not being restructured any longer. And Rajan was really, if you remember, Karan, in your first part of your interview, you said he had shifted the whole mindset in favor of banks going after promoters and not sort of just sitting there and waiting for political calls.
He identified it as the second element of his legacy.
And he was making exactly, and Mr. Rajan was putting a lot of pressure on promoters to sell their assets to pay back their loans, and some of them loans running upward of 1 lakh crore each business.
So what you're saying is that the whole issue of interest rates was devised as a way of shifting him out of office, or putting pressure on him to back off?
I think there was a lot of pressure, Karan, and and just about 4 weeks ago, there was a statement by S. Gurumurthy, who is considered a Sangh Parivar ideologue, in the Economic Times, where he said that Rajan had pushed big businesses scared them into withdrawing into a corner. He used the word scared big businesses. Now, that's a serious charge coming from somebody who regularly gives economic inputs into...
You're making a very interesting point, Venu. You're suggesting that, in fact, the controversy that arose about interest rates was not actually to do with interest rates itself. It was a controversy created to take the pressure off industrialists who were being pushed by Rajan and who couldn't take the pressure that he was putting on them. That may well be the case, but I just want to point it out. It's a very interesting interpretation. Obviously, it's not one that Dr. Rajan himself shared with me in that interview. Now, Mihir, Dr. Rajan also spoke about the length of the governor's term. He says 3 years would be too short. He says 8 years would be too long. And he suggested something in between, presumably 5 or 6 years. Would you say that's a better practice than the present arrangement of giving the governor a 3-year term, usually followed by a 2-year extension, although Dr. Rajan never got that extension?
I think that he's quite right. I think what you should think of in terms of a governor's term is that it should be assumed that a governor will survive the government that appoints him or her. So that is why it should be 5 or 6 years. It should, a term that is longer or as long as the Lok Sabha itself. In order to demonstrate and to bring home the fact that this is not a partisan appointment, this is not a political appointment, this is an independent authority that derives, in fact, its only credibility and power from being independent of the fiscal authority. So it has to, 5 or 6 is probably the ideal period.
M.K. Venu, there was a certain element of the thinking you've heard from Mihir Sharma that actually lay in the logic Dr. Rajan gave me for making sure that the term was more than 3 years. He said a term beyond 3 years ought to be given to the governor to protect him from short-term political pressures, although he didn't use the word political. Given the character of Indian politics, does that explanation gel with you, that a governor needs to be protected from short-term pressures, hence he must have a term longer than 3 years, closer to 5 or 6?
Yeah, definitely, Karan. If you look at the previous 4 governors, 3 or 4 governors, they got 3 years plus 2. Now this 3+2 is a very clumsy arrangement, because inherent in this arrangement is a certain leverage that the political masters have. At the end of 3 years, well, we may or may not give you an extension. So I think it's better to give the governor a full 5-year term, which Mr. Rajan himself recommended. And I think even now this government they could have done it in the case of Urjit Patel, but they have not done so. It gives me the impression that that Delhi wants to keep some sort of lever on the governor.
Absolutely. Just for the sake of the audience, Alad, when you say Delhi, you actually mean all governments, because it's a long time since a governor was given a straight 5-year term at the outset, although it has happened once, I believe. Let's come here to what the governor said by way of his explanation for the speech that he made on tolerance at the IIT last year in October, and why it was important to do so. He said, and I'm quoting him, it was his moral responsibility. He said it was a legitimate duty to speak on these issues because, as he put it, when public figures address young minds, they have to talk about good citizenship and how it's achieved. Did that explanation gel with you?
I think that is part of what he said at the time. He said that he wasn't targeting anyone. He wasn't talking about. He said it then. He's saying it again. It was a broad statement about the nature of tolerance and how it is crucial for any modern economy and any modern democracy to be able to deal with difference. And unless you can deal with difference, you're not even a dynamic economy, as China is now finding out. This is not in any way a new or uncontroversial thing to say. But nevertheless, it is very important that that this message is hammered home as often as possible, and I think Rajan did it exceedingly well. It was a little absurd that it blew up into an issue.
So you completely agree that this is a legitimate area and subject for the governor to talk about?
I think that it is utterly insane that some people think that a governor of the RBI should be silent about everything that is not specifically to do with monetary policy. Next, we'll be saying that ministers should only be talking about specifically those issues that relate to their portfolio. We should, where does this come from? If you're a public figure, you talk, and the more talking we get from public figures, the better.
M.K. Venu, Dr. Rajan said that his comments about tolerance were not an attack on the government, but he admitted quite readily that he had the environment of the day, that was his phrase, at the back of his mind. The question I want to ask you is this: is he being a little disingenuous when he says that his speech wasn't really anti-government, because the environment of the day was clearly conditioned by the behavior A of BJP MPs and B of the wider Sangh Parivar?
Yeah, in a sense, Karan, I would tend to agree with you, because the environment was such that if you went to IIT or if you went to any of these colleges or JNU, the students were bound to ask you those questions, because they were exercised about those issues. And of course, the governor, as Mihir said, had every right to give his views. Maybe his critics were trying to compare him with the Fed Reserve chiefs like Alan Greenspan or Ben Bernanke, who normally don't from public forums talk about US politics or race relations in the US, or issues like tolerance, etc. But then I would quickly add, India is very different, and as Rajan himself said, there is political noise all the time.
Okay.
And so you have to respond to political noise which may spill over to the economy. And Arvind Subramaniam, Karan, I might point out, is on record himself, the chief economic advisor to Jaitley, that social cleavages, tensions can have an impact on growth, long-term impact on growth. And after saying that, he said, I'll expound on this, not now, but after I leave the government. Now, what do you make of that?
Absolutely. In other words, he lacked, as you're suggesting, I suspect, the courage or the openness or the honesty to speak out. Governor Rajan didn't. Let's come very briefly to something, Mihir, that the governor raised in part 2, which we've just broadcast today. He clearly gave me the impression that he believes some form of planning commission is necessary because some form of planning remains important for India. Did you get that impression too?
I think that, yes, he did say, we need to have something that is thinking in a strategic and analytical way about India's future. the problem is, I think, in the word planning, and in India we associate the word planning with the old Soviet mechanism of quantitative restrictions, telling people how much they can produce, pushing certain resources in certain directions, and that's no longer what anyone expects the Planning Commission to be doing. So I think the Niti Aayog already, I mean, look, the Planning Commission used to produce a 1-year plan, a 5-year plan, and a 20-year perspective plan. The Niti Aayog is going to be producing a 3-year plan, 3-year scenario, a 7-year scenario, and a 17 or 18-year scenario.
The time frames of all that
The time frames
changed.
have changed, and they're calling it a scenario instead of a plan. You know, it's the same thing.
Now, M.K. Venu, the governor also explained why he believes mini bank rather than big bang reforms are better for India. He says mini bank reforms don't create the same opposition, and secondly, they're easier for the system to implement. Do you agree with him?
Yeah, current experience so far, if you look at, we've completed 25 years of economic reforms. In fact, today I was speaking to Yashwant Sinha, who was finance minister, on 2 occasions. He said the same thing. He said in India, reforms work only if they are implemented in a very gradualistic way, and you have to look for you know, small incremental measures which have optimal outcome, rather than talk about big bang, which scares off people. It creates a lot of political resistance, which we have seen in the case of NDA also. The first 1 year when they tried to push the land bill in the way they try to do, or the way they try to push labor reforms, I think he made complete sense.
Okay. The British, I'm tempted to say, have a wonderful expression that captures what you're saying. It's a strange expression, but it's slowly, slowly, catchy monkey. God knows where it comes from. Probably it has a certain Chinese influence, if you ask me, but I noticed you were nodding your head. Did you want to come in on that point quickly?
I wanted to say that it's extremely unfortunate that Raghuram Rajan seems to have been house-trained by the RBI in 3 years into sounding exactly like every other policy economist we've ever had in this country. It is utterly absurd to claim that big bang reforms, or by which we all mean the same thing, which is labor reforms, cannot happen just because we do not have the systems in place to create them. Put the systems in place. Where is this pretend idea that you add up these tiny little things that we've done over 25 years, and somehow it adds up to, it doesn't even add up to the 2 years that got done between 91 and 1993. You know,
in other words, what you're saying is we definitely need big bang reforms.
We needed them, and it is extremely unfortunate that somebody, this is why he's a macroeconomist and not a microeconomist, and it shows.
And what you're also saying is that on that particular point, you vehemently disagree with him.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, on that very interesting note, we're going to have to end this particular discussion. My thanks to you for coming to the studio. My thanks also to M.K. Venu. And if you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye.